The sun sagged low over the cattle town, bleeding orange and violet into a sky stretched thin as rawhide. Dust clung to the air, stirred by boots and wagon wheels, and every creak of leather and rattle of spurs felt like part of a song the town had been humming for years, slow, weary, and dangerous. Men crowded around the auction pen, their voices hoarse from whiskey and laughter, calling out bids for bay geldings and roan mares. The auctioneer's hat was tipped back, sweat dripping down his temple as he barked prices over the noise. A man stood apart from the rest, leaning against a hitching post with his hat brim low over his eyes. He was tall and still, a silhouette carved from dust and distance. His coat bore the trail's grime, and his boots were worn to the leather's bone. He watched the horses change hands with disinterest, his gaze fixed on something beyond the bustle. A man used to being alone, a man who rarely spoke unless there was a need. The auctioneer's voice shifted, sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Lot 33, he called, and the crowd's roar faltered. A special lot tonight. From behind the corral came a figure not of 4 legs, but 2. A woman stepped into view, skirts torn and dirty, her hands bound loosely in front of her. The crowd erupted in jeers and murmurs, some men laughing, some spitting at the sight of her. She climbed the wooden platform with the grace of someone used to keeping her chin high despite the weight of every eye on her. Her hair, tangled from dust and wind, framed a face as pale as moonlight, but lit with a spark that made the noise fall away. Her lips parted, her voice clear, rich with desperation and fire. "Don't buy the horse," she cried, gaze sweeping the crowd before locking on a lone man beneath the hat. "Buy me, rancher. I'll be yours forever." A hush followed. Some men chuckled. Others leaned closer, curious. The rancher's head lifted slightly, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim. He said nothing. The auctioneer grinned, sensing the tension ripple through the square like heat from a forge. "You heard her. A fine mare, and a finer prize besides. Who'll start the bidding?" Coins clinked, offers shouted. The woman's gaze never left the rancher. She seemed to study him with something sharper than hope, as though she could sense in him the type of man who didn't take women like her to bed or town to brag. He stood rigid, silent, his jaw tight beneath a day's stubble. $5, someone hollered. 7. The numbers rose, and she flinched at the laughter that followed each call. She spoke again, softer but carrying over the din. "Please." The rancher shifted his weight, pushed away from the post. The crowd parted as he stepped forward, his boots striking the packed dirt with quiet authority. He stopped in front of the platform, eyes raised to meet hers for the first time. Whatever he saw there made him reach into his coat pocket. He didn't haggle, didn't join the game of raised hands and shouted sums. He simply handed over enough cash to silence the auctioneer mid-sentence. The man who had offered 10 cursed under his breath. The thrill of competition gone. The auctioneer snatched the bills, declared sold, with forced cheer, and the crowd erupted again, half in mock applause, half in mockery. She didn't smile. She stepped down, her bare feet kicking up dust, and he cut the rope binding her wrists with a flick of his pocket knife. "Come on," he said, his voice a low rumble, and she followed him without hesitation. His horse waited at the edge of town, tied to the railing of a saloon porch. He swung into the saddle, offered her a hand. She took it, and he pulled her up behind him. No words passed between them as he turned the horse down the dirt street, the town's noise fading behind. They rode in silence, the prairie swallowing the last rays of sun as they pushed toward the horizon. Her arms rested lightly around his waist, tentative at first, then steadier as the miles grew between them and the place she'd been auctioned. She breathed in the scent of leather and sagebrush, felt the rise and fall of his frame as he guided the horse forward with quiet skill. Finally, she spoke, her voice carried by the soft whistle of evening wind. "You're not like them." He said nothing. "You're not a man who buys women." His hands tightened on the reins, the muscles in his shoulders shifting beneath his coat. She waited, but no answer came. Instead, his horse crested a ridge, and the world opened wide. A sea of grass, rolling hills bathed in fading gold, the skies stretching forever. She clutched his coat tighter, sensing the weight in his silence. It wasn't indifference. It was something heavier, like grief that had settled into his bones. She studied him from behind, tracing the scar that cut across his cheek, the way his posture held both strength and weariness. As the night deepened, a chill swept over the land. He stopped by a thin creek and let the horse drink. She slid down from the saddle, legs trembling from the ride, and crouched at the water's edge, cupping her hands to drink. He stayed mounted, scanning the dark horizon with sharp eyes. "They'll come for me," she said softly. He glanced down at her, his expression unreadable. "They won't let me go," she continued, her voice steady but laced with fear she tried to hide. He finally dismounted, crouched by the creek, and filled his canteen. "I know," he said. His tone wasn't comfort or dismissal. It was acknowledgment, a fact as certain as the stars beginning to pierce the dark. She shivered. "Then why'd you take me?" He capped the canteen, rose to his full height. "Didn't see a choice," he muttered, leading the horse back toward the trail. She followed, barefoot and silent, her mind racing. They rode on. The moon hung low, pale light spilling across the prairie. At the edge of a lonely hill, a row of wooden crosses jutted from the ground, each one leaning with the weight of wind and time. He slowed as they passed, his gaze flicking to graves, his jaw tightening. "You've buried folks," she said quietly. He said nothing, but the set of his shoulders spoke volumes. They pressed on until a faint outline of a cabin emerged from the darkness, a small ranch house, simple but sturdy, a corral beside it. Smoke rose faintly from a chimney, carrying the scent of mesquite wood. He dismounted, tied the horse, and led her to the door. The cabin's single room was spare, a bed in one corner, a table with a single chair, a stove flickering with dying embers. He gestured toward the cot against the far wall. "You can rest there." She sank onto the cot, exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket. He moved about quietly, stoking the fire, setting a kettle on to boil. The silence between them wasn't cruel. It was the silence of two people who had lived too long with danger to waste words. When he finally spoke, it was without looking at her. "Sleep while you can." She lay back, staring at the ceiling beams, her heart still racing from the auction, from the ride, from this man who had saved her or bought her. She couldn't tell which yet. Outside, the prairie wind moaned against the cabin walls, and somewhere far off, a coyote yipped. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come easy. Instead, her mind lingered on the way he had looked at her in the square, the way he hadn't flinched or laughed, the way he'd handed over his money with no words. She rolled to her side, glancing toward him. He sat at the table, hat tipped low, rifle propped beside him. He wasn't resting. The morning came gray and brittle, frost clinging to the edges of the corral fence and the low grasses that spread like a sea around the cabin. Smoke trailed from the chimney in a thin, wavering thread. She woke to the smell of coffee and the distant sound of hooves, shifting restlessly in the cold. The cot creaked beneath her as she sat up, eyes adjusting to the dim room. He was gone, but his coat hung from a peg near the door, and a rifle leaned within easy reach. She pulled the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders, stepping to the window. The prairie was endless, a canvas of pale light and wind. He was out there already, moving among the horses. Even from this distance, she could see the precision in his movements, the way he carried himself with a quiet authority that came from years of solitude and hard work. He checked each animal, his hands sure, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. When she opened the door, the cold struck like a slap. He didn't turn when she approached, though she sensed he'd register her footsteps. The smell of hay and leather filled the air. "Coffee's on the table," he said without looking at her, voice low, rough from disuse. She lingered by the corral fence, fingers curling around the weathered wood. "You didn't sleep." "Didn't need to," he replied, cinching a saddle strap. She studied him. The scar on his cheek caught the morning light, a thin white line that ran from the edge of his jaw to the hollow near his eye. It wasn't fresh, but it carried a story, one she doubted he'd ever tell freely. "You think they're coming," she said, his hand still for a fraction of a second, and then resumed their work. "They will—" She swallowed. "They won't stop. You should have left me there." That made him look at her. Finally, His gaze was sharp, assessing. You wanted me to. She shook her head, her breath fogging in the cold. I wanted out. I didn't think anyone would help. You weren't wrong, he said simply, mounting his horse. He glanced toward the horizon, where pale sunlight licked at the hills. You're safe here for now. That's all I can promise. They rode the perimeter of the land that day, silence stretching between them like taut wire. The prairie wind cut through her tattered dress, and she clutched the spare coat around her shoulders, its scent of leather and smoke oddly grounding. He didn't explain where they were going, only gestured occasionally to markers in the land, a creek that split the property, a cluster of cottonwoods that offered rare shade. He moved like a man who'd memorized every inch of this country, who trusted his own senses more than any map. By midday they returned, and he handed her a plate of bread and jerky without ceremony. She ate in silence, aware of his eyes occasionally flicking toward her, as though measuring how much strength she had left. "Why'd you come to town?" she asked, breaking the stillness. "Needed a horse," he said. "You paid for me instead." He didn't respond right away. He set his cup down, fingers resting on the handle a moment longer than necessary. "Couldn't watch it," he said finally. "Didn't sit right." Her throat tightened. "You don't even know my name." He shrugged. "Doesn't matter." Something in his bluntness stung, though she couldn't decide if it was cruelty or honesty. She studied him as he moved about the cabin, noting the precise way he loaded bullets into a rifle, how his gaze flickered to the door every few seconds. This was a man who lived as though danger was always close. That night, he set an extra rifle on the table. "You know how to shoot?" She nodded once. "A little." "Learn more," he said, sliding a box of cartridges toward her. The firelight flickered over his face, carving hard lines into his features. He showed her how to load the weapon, how to steady her breath, how to squeeze instead of jerk the trigger. She practiced, fingers trembling, until her movements grew smoother. He watched in silence, offering no praise, no criticism, just quiet instruction. When she asked about his scar, he said nothing, only moved to the window and peered into the darkness beyond. The air inside thickened with unspoken truths. She felt his caution like a second presence, a shadow in every corner. Later, as she washed the dishes, he stood outside under the stars, cigarette ember glowing faintly in his hand. She stepped onto the porch, arms wrapped around herself. "You lost someone," she said softly. He didn't look at her. "Everyone has." "Your wife." He exhaled smoke, the faint glow illuminating his jaw. "And a boy." She said nothing, throat tightening. He didn't elaborate, didn't look at her, but the weight in his voice was heavier than any detail he could have given. She wanted to ask what happened, how long ago, but something in his stance told her it was not a wound he shared. Instead, she said, "I wasn't always with them. The gang." He flicked ash into the dirt, still not looking her way. "They took me. I stayed too long." He glanced at her then, and his eyes softened slightly. "You ran. I didn't think I'd get this far." "You're here," he said simply. Before she could reply, a sharp sound cut through the stillness, a crack of gunfire in the distance. Faint but unmistakable. He froze, cigarette dropping from his fingers. She felt her pulse spike, hands gripping the railing. He moved quickly, dousing the lantern inside the cabin. The sudden darkness was suffocating. "Get inside," he ordered quietly. She obeyed, crouching low near the table as he took position at the window, rifle steady. Another shot echoed, closer this time, followed by the distant whinny of a spooked horse. She could barely make out his silhouette, broad shoulders framed against a faint glow of moonlight. The night was suddenly alive with tension. Wind rattled the windows, and the creak of the porch boards beneath his boots was deafening. She clutched the rifle he'd given her, knuckles white. Minutes crawled by, each one heavier than the last. No more gunfire came, but she swore she could feel eyes on the cabin, predators circling. Finally he spoke, voice low. "They're scouting." Her breath caught. "They know I'm here." He didn't answer, just adjusted his rifle and settled into his watch. She huddled closer to the wall, every muscle in her body trembling, though she tried to hold herself steady. The fire had died to embers, and the room felt colder than the wind outside. Hours passed, and he didn't move. She must have dozed, because when she opened her eyes, pale dawn light seeped through the cracks in the shutters. He was still at the window, face drawn tight, hands steady. She rose stiffly, stepping to the door. He glanced at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. "They'll come," she said. "Not today," he replied, voice hoarse. "Why not?" "They're waiting," testing the ground. She swallowed hard. "They won't stop." He finally turned fully to face her, and for a heartbeat, she saw something fierce and unyielding in his gaze. "Neither will I." The words settled over her like a promise and a warning both. She stared at him, this man who bought her freedom but offered no explanation, who carried grief like a second skin yet stood ready to fight for her. Something inside her shifted, a strange blend of fear and trust. Outside, the morning was eerily still. She stepped onto the porch, hugging herself as she scanned the empty hills. Somewhere out there, they were watching, waiting for their moment. The days that followed were quiet, but the silence was not peace. It was a taut string stretched across the prairie, ready to snap. She felt in the way he moved through the ranch, every step measured, every glance toward the horizon sharpened by instinct. He repaired the fence lines, oiled his rifles, and checked the corral twice each night. She shadowed him, learning his rhythm, aware that his caution wasn't paranoia but experience carved deep into his bones. Each dawn came with frost clinging to the grass and a sky bruised purple and gray. She woke early, sometimes before him, and watched him saddle the horses with the ease of a man who'd done it more times than he could count. He said little, but his silence was no longer cold. It had softened like the prairie wind when the sun crept over the hills. She found herself studying the way he worked, his strength tempered by patience, and how he glanced at her from time to time, as though gauging how much he could handle. She proved she was capable, and he didn't coddle her. He taught her to shoot with both hands, to reload quickly, and to track movement in the grass by the shift of wind or the ripple of a shadow. Her hands blistered from hauling water and stacking wood, but she didn't complain. He noticed, though he didn't say so. Instead, he left a pair of worn gloves on the porch rail one morning. No explanation given. She slipped them on, smiling to herself. At night, they spoke more. The fire cast its soft glow across his face, carving out the lines of a man who had seen too much loss. He never told her everything, but bits of his story surfaced like rocks in a shallow creek. The boy had been 5, blonde hair and a laugh that echoed in the cabin walls. His wife had been kind, quiet, and strong. Both had been taken in one night of violence that left him alone with a burned barn and a grave he dug with his own hands. He didn't say how he'd survived, but his voice hardened when he spoke of it, as if even memory could still draw blood. She told him pieces of her own story, though shame clung to her words. She'd been young when she fell in with the outlaw gang, seduced not just by their leader's charm, but by the false sense of belonging they offered. That belonging had curdled into chains. She bore scars beneath her dress that she didn't show him, but her voice betrayed the weight she carried. He didn't judge her, and that silence meant more than pity ever could. The tension outside the cabin thickened with each passing day. He found boot prints in the creek bed, fresh and deliberate. One morning, he discovered a single feather tied to the fence post, an outlaw's calling card, mocking in its simplicity. She saw his expression tighten when he pulled it free, but he said nothing, only burned it in the stove. "They're close," she murmured that night, watching him load bullets into a box with steady hands. "They're always close," he said, "but they're watching, waiting for us to slip. And we won't." His gaze lifted to hers, and a ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Not if I can help it." They fortified the cabin. He reinforced the shutters, dug shallow trenches near the barn, and placed extra ammunition near every doorway. She helped, her fear tempered by a determination she hadn't felt in years. She'd spent so long running, hiding, surrendering to fate. Now, for the first time, she felt the strange steadiness of standing her ground. The prairie nights grew colder, and one evening they sat by the fire after supper, shoulders close. She cradled a tin mug of coffee, staring into the flames. He was cleaning a revolver, the meticulous motion soothing in their precision. "You saved me," she said softly. He shook his head. "You saved yourself. I just gave you a horse." She laughed quietly, a sound she hadn't made in months. "You gave me more than that." He glanced at her then, really looked, and for a moment she felt the weight of his gaze settle like a blanket. There was no hunger in it, only recognition. Two people carrying different kinds of wounds, each finding a strange solace in the other. "I didn't save them," he said after a pause. "My family. I was too far out with the herd. Came home to—" He trailed off, words catching in his throat. She reached across the table, fingers brushing his wrist. He stilled, eyes flicking to her hand, then back to her face. The contact was brief, but it lingered between them like a promise. The following morning, a neighbor rode up fast, his horse lathered with sweat. She stood on the porch as he dismounted, breathless, eyes wide with urgency. "They're burning out farms," he said, voice raw. "2 places gone already. They're pushing west toward here." He didn't ask questions, just nodded once and handed the man a jug of water. "You tell the others to pull back if they can," he said. "No sense dying for a fight they don't want." The rider hesitated, glancing at her, then at him. "You gonna run?" He shook his head. "No." The man swallowed, nodded, and rode off hard, leaving a trail of dust. She stepped closer. "They'll come soon," she said. "Yeah," he replied, voice calm. "Soon." They spent the day preparing. The cabin no longer a home, but a stronghold. He showed her how to set traps along the ridge, how to tie off a lantern wick, so it could be smashed and used as a weapon. She memorized his instructions, her fears sharpening into focus. As night fell, the prairie was unervingly quiet. The usual coyote cries were absent, and the wind seemed to hold its breath. She sat on the porch steps, rifle across her lap, watching the horizon. He joined her, settling beside her with his back against the railing. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. "Taking me?" He thought for a long moment, eyes scanning the dark hills. "No," he said finally. "I'd do it again." Her chest tightened, a warmth blooming beneath the fear. She turned her face toward him, but he was already looking at her, his expression unreadable. The firelight spilling through the open doorway cast a soft glow across his features, highlighting the hard lines softened by weariness. "You remind me of her," he said quietly. "My wife." She blinked, startled. "Because I'm—" "No," he interrupted gently. "Not because you look like her. Because you fight like her." She didn't take kindness easy either. Emotion rose in her throat, and she swallowed hard. "I don't know how to thank you." He shook his head, shifting his gaze back to the horizon. "Don't need thanks. Just stay alive." A flicker of movement caught her eye then, a distant shadow against the fading twilight. She stiffened, pointing. He followed her gesture, his body tensing as he spotted it too, a lone rider on a ridge, silhouetted against the bruised sky, watching. Neither of them moved. The rider stayed for a long moment, then turned and disappeared into the darkness. She gripped the rifle tighter. "They're here." "Yeah," he murmured, standing slowly. His hand brushed her shoulder briefly, a steadying touch. "Get some rest while you can." "I won't sleep." He gave her a small, grim smile. "Neither will I." They went inside, barring the door, lanterns dimmed to shadows. She curled on the cot, rifle clutched close, every creak of the cabin board setting her nerves on edge. He sat by the window, rifle balanced across his knees, a silent sentinel. Outside, the prairie wind whispered against the walls like a warning. Somewhere beyond the hills, the outlaws gathered. Dawn came blood-red. The horizon split with a thin streak of light that painted the prairie in hues of copper and ash. The cabin stood still and silent, every shutter closed tight, every crack sealed against the cold. He stood at the window, rifle ready, eyes scanning the ridge. She crouched behind the table, revolver in hand, the weight of it no longer foreign. Her breath came slow and steady, though fear coiled tight in her chest. The first rider appeared at the crest of the hill, a dark silhouette against the rising sun. Then another, and another. A dozen, maybe more, fanning out like wolves circling prey. Their leader rode in the center, a tall man draped in a long black coat, his posture easy, almost casual. Even at this distance, she knew it was him, her stomach twisted. The man who had owned her life, who had called her his possession, had come to reclaim what he thought was his. He watched them through the narrow slit in the shutter, his face carved from stone. "They're spread thin," he murmured, "trying to flush us out." She swallowed hard. "Will it work?" "Not if we stay patient." The riders moved closer, their shapes clear now, rifles gleaming in the morning light. The leader raised a hand, and the group halted, horses stamping nervously in the chill air. A voice called out, low and carrying across the open space, "We don't want blood, friend. Give her up and we'll ride on." His jaw tightened. "Stay low," he whispered to her. He stepped outside, rifle in hand, coat flaring with a breeze. The silence that followed was almost reverent, as if the land itself was holding its breath. "I'm not giving her up," he called back, voice calm and steady. A ripple of laughter rolled through the outlaw ranks, harsh and cruel. The leader nudged his horse forward, the sun glinting off the silver buckle at his chest. "You think she's yours? She's nothing but a runaway. Ain't worth dying over." "She's not yours anymore," he said, his voice like gravel. The outlaw's smile widened. "Then you'll die for her." He raised his arm, and the first shot rang out. The world exploded into chaos. Bullets whined past the cabin, which splintered, and horses screamed. She ducked behind a table, heart pounding, and returned fire through a crack in the shutters. Her shot dropped a rider who had leaned too close, his body crumpling into the dust. He moved like a man carved from instinct, firing with deadly precision, each shot placed with calm efficiency. He shifted from window to door, using every angle, every shadow. She saw him glance at her, a flicker of approval in his eyes when her shot found its mark again. The outlaws surged forward, their leader bellowing orders. One rider reached the porch, but she was ready. She flung open the door and fired point blank, the recoil jarring her shoulder. The man toppled backward, dead before he hit the dirt. She slammed the door shut, breath ragged, hands trembling but steady enough to reload. Smoke from their rifles mingled with the morning mist, thick and acrid. The cabin shook with the force of gunfire, but they held their ground. She felt the fear sharpening her senses, turning every sound into a signal. The crunch of boots outside, the hollow clink of bullets being loaded, the softness of wind sneaking through the cracks. "Left side," he barked, and she pivoted, firing at a shadow darting near the corral. A scream followed, high and short, then silence. The outlaws regrouped, pulling back briefly. She peered through the window, sweat running cold down her spine. They were circling now, preparing for a full rush. The leader raised his arm, signaling again, and the riders fanned wide, ready to strike. He set his rifle down and drew his revolver, jaw clenched. "They'll push hard this time." She swallowed. "We can hold them." His eyes met hers, and there was something in his gaze she hadn't seen before, not just resolve, but trust. "Stay close," he said. The attack came like a storm, riders charging from both sides. The sound of hooves thundered against the earth, and bullets tore through the shutters. He moved fast, slipping outside under cover of smoke. She heard the crack of his revolver, the grunt of a man falling. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm, to follow his plan. She ducked behind the stove and smashed one of the oil lanterns on the porch, fire spilling onto the dirt as two riders leapt from their saddles. The flames roared, forcing them back. She fired through the smoke, dropping another. Her ears rang with gunfire. Her arms ached, but she held her ground. Outside, he was a shadow among chaos, his revolver barking with deadly rhythm. He took a bullet to the shoulder, but didn't falter, driving forward through the melee. The outlaw leader spotted him and charged, spurring his horse hard. The two met in a blur of dust and gunfire, close enough to see each other's faces. She saw the moment of recognition in the outlaw's sneer, the arrogance in his eyes. He fired first, grazing the rancher's side, but the rancher didn't hesitate. His shot was clean, precise, and final. The leader toppled from his saddle, the thunder of his fall silencing the chaos for a breath. The remaining outlaws faltered, their formation breaking. Some fled, spurred by fear. Others dragged their wounded away. She stumbled out onto the porch, rifle raised, her heart hammering as she scanned the field. Bodies lay scattered, smoke curling up from the grass. He stood near the leader's body, revolver lowered, blood staining his sleeve. She ran to him, knees weak with relief. "You're bleeding." He glanced at the wound, dismissing it with a grunt. "It's nothing." She pressed a hand to his side, forced him to sit on the porch steps. Her hands trembled as she bound the wound, tears streaking her dirt-stained cheeks. "Don't say that," she whispered. "Don't pretend it's nothing." He watched her quietly, his face pale but calm. "You did good," he said softly. "Better than good." She swallowed hard, meeting his gaze. "We're alive because of you." "No," he said, voice low but steady. "We're alive because of us." The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and blood, mingled with the faint sweetness of prairie grass. She glanced out at the field, at the scattered bodies and the smoke curling from the lantern fire. It was over. For now. They buried the dead that afternoon, working in silence beneath a sky that had turned impossible.